Today, we're going to talk about effective communication for crucial conversations. In talking about communication, we recognize that that's something that we do all day, every day. But more specifically, what we're going to talk about today is how to communicate more effectively during those conversations that are so critical for us as caregivers. Conversations where we are conveying critical information, asking for assistance, or just trying to get someone to understand what's going on right at this particular moment. A conversation is a way of transferring thoughts, feelings, observations, and ideas from one person to another in order to try to arrive at a mutual understanding and, if needed, an agreed upon plan of action. We typically think of communication as being either written or verbal. Writing and reading account for about 25% of the time we spend in communication during our waking hours. The remaining 75% of our communication time is made up of speaking and listening. Since a relatively small amount of our time is spent on written communication, today we're going to concentrate more on speaking and listening. Most often when we think about communicating something, we think about the words that we or someone else says. And in fact, words are one of the most powerful tools that humans possess. Words can start wars, diffuse anger, and nurture love. Words can be easily misunderstood, however, especially if the people trying to communicate don't share the same understanding of the words being used or the situation they are trying to convey information about. One of the best examples of this lack of shared understanding of words occurs in conversations between caregivers and medical professionals. Here's a simple example. A medical professional says, "Take this medicine 3 times a day with food." The caregiver understands the 3 times a day with food and gives the medication at each meal. What the medical professional actually meant, though, is that each dose of the medication should be taken as nearly as possible to 8 hours apart so that there's a steady level of the medicine in the blood at all times. Taking the medication 8 hours apart might mean that it's given at 6 a.m., 2 p.m., and 10 p.m., not the usual time for meals for most of us. But words are only one piece of the puzzle for speaking and listening. We also communicate non-verbally through posture, facial expressions, eye contact, hand gestures, and tone of voice. In fact, studies have shown that somewhere between 70 and 93% of all communication is nonverbal. Have you ever had someone literally turn their back on you when you're talking to them? This is a rather extreme form of posture and body position, but what it's communicating is very clear. Effective body language for a critical conversation includes sitting erect but relaxed. Typically, our hands should be resting in our lap or by our sides, and we should be positioned so that we can see the other person's face easily. All of us recognize that facial expressions play a huge part in communication. Think about smiles, frowns, or the look when someone's surprised. Our eyes are very communicative also. Tears, downcast eyes, rolling eyes all tell us a lot about someone is really thinking, regardless of what they say. We rely on tone to convey our mood. "Hi, I'm home," versus "Hi, I'm home." On the second version, we know that I'm not in a good mood or that I'm not really happy about being home, even if you know nothing about my day. Nonverbal communication, regardless of the specific form, conveys how we really feel about a situation. In fact, if verbal and nonverbal communication are at odds with one another, it's the nonverbal communication that will be seen as being true. Unlike other everyday skills such as reading, writing, and math, we usually don't get any significant training in successful verbal communication and listening as we grow up. Most of what we learn about these skills is based on observation of others, usually those in our family, and our own experiences of what works and what doesn't seem to work to get the results we want from our communication attempts. I use the term communication attempts intentionally because we often don't communicate to others precisely what we meant to communicate, and sometimes we're way off the mark. Let me give you a simple example that happened to me recently. One of my daughters called me about a week ago to ask me a question. I asked her if I could call her back in just a few minutes because I was at Lowe's buying steaks. Her response, "Gee, Mom, I didn't know you ever bought steaks." At that point, I realized that she thought I was at Lowe's Food buying steaks to eat, when I was actually at Lowe's Home Improvement buying tomato steaks for my garden. Much of our communication oops are not that easy to correct, and many have much more dire consequences, especially for caregivers who are already stressed from their ongoing responsibilities. So today we're going to spend some time talking about how to improve verbal, nonverbal, and listening skills, and some things to consider when communication with others is even more crucial than usual. Crucial conversations take place when opinions vary, emotions run strong, and the stakes are high. According to Patterson et al. In their book about crucial conversations, these conversations are challenging, frustrating, frightening, or annoying, or some combination of all of these, because the results can have a huge impact on our quality of life or the quality of life for someone that we care a lot about. In addition to the emotional impact of such conversations, they actually cause a physical reaction. Here's what that looks like. Something you disagree with is said about a topic you care a great deal about. The hairs on your neck stand up. The amygdala, which we talked about in the class on dementia and the brain, are located deep inside the temporal lobes of the brain, about here. Those amygdala automatically activate the fight or flight response. Adrenaline, which is a stimulant, pours into the bloodstream. The brain diverts oxygen to the important protective task, like increasing blood flow in the large muscles of the arms and legs, so that we can fight or run if need be. At the same time, blood flow to the higher reasoning levels and those portions of the brain responsible for that actually decreases. The result is that our IQ ends up being about that of the average turkey, which is considered one of the least intelligent animals alive. No wonder we try to avoid these conversations. In addition to not wanting to feel like a turkey, we often back away from these conversations because we're afraid that we will only make things worse. So conversations that are crucial require even more care to make sure that communication is clear and conveys what we intend. Let's talk about some obstacles to those crucial conversations being productive. The first is being judgmental. Telling others how you think they are or how they should be says that only your way of perceiving the world is correct. Giving advice instead of listening. This sounds like, if I were you, I would. Moralizing. A good daughter would do this, or someone who really cares about us would never do that. Finishing sentences for others. Talking too much. Responding in trite, comforting words, such as saying, "Keep your head up. It's not really as bad as you think it is." Being distracted or interrupting. In addition, it's important to remember that we all see the world differently based on our past experiences and current beliefs. I'm going to use a picture to illustrate in a simple way that our views of the world differ. What's the first thing you see as you look at this picture? How many saw a rabbit first? A duck first? Yet we're all looking at the very same picture. We're going to talk now about steps to prepare for crucial conversations that will help you communicate more effectively and hopefully achieve the goal you want to achieve without looking and sounding like a turkey. To prepare for a crucial conversation, whether it will take place with a family member, friend, or a medical care provider, here are some things to consider. Before the conversation, arrange to talk face-to-face during the conversation if at all possible. Text, emails, and phone calls are great for keeping in touch and for general updates when both parties already have the same basic understanding of the situation. But those modes of communication can be easily misinterpreted without tone and body language. If you must use written communication, be succinct and read over what you have written carefully before you hit the send button. If possible, make sure the conversation takes place in a quiet place that's free of interruptions. It's hard enough to initiate and maintain a crucial conversation under the best of circumstances. Interruptions, whether direct or indirect, increase stress and make it more difficult to maintain the flow of what is being said or listened to. If you're talking with a friend or family member, it might be helpful to schedule the time to talk when the person living with dementia is being entertained by someone else or has gone to bed for the night. Think carefully about what message you want to get across. Do you need to make sure someone understands what you are seeing happen with the person living with dementia? Do you need to ask for more support or help? Do you need more information on available options for treatment of behaviors? Identify the most important point you want to make or question you want to ask. If there's more than one really pressing issue, prioritize those issues so that you will make sure to address the most important one or ones within the time and attention limitations of the conversation. Make notes or a list and prioritize the topics. One of the things we all tend to do is to try to cover too much in a single conversation. That often leaves the person we are talking with overwhelmed with information and/or requests. Sometimes we really don't have a choice but to try to squeeze in as much as possible during a conversation, but try to avoid this situation as much as possible. For some people, it's also helpful to think about how you might expect the other person to respond and what you might say in return. This is especially applicable in conversations with family members that we know better. Just be careful that you're not so sure of what the other person is going to say that you fail to actually hear what they're saying during the conversation. Consider involving a neutral third party who can jot down some notes and plan the role of mediator if that's needed. Sometimes it's really helpful for someone not directly involved in a conversation to say to each person, "What I heard you saying is," and paraphrase what each person has said. During the crucial conversation itself, state the purpose. Do that as succinctly as possible. An example would be, "I'd like to talk about how your father is changing and the help we need." Be specific when describing what is happening that makes the conversation so important to you. Try not to use labels to describe what's happening. Instead, describe what you're actually seeing. Labels are like the picture of the duck/rabbit. We don't all think the same thing when descriptions are vague. An example would be saying, "He just can't get it together anymore." Instead say, "When we talked last, our father could feed himself and get dressed if I got his clothes out. Now when he sits down at the table, he doesn't pick up his fork and start to eat until I remind him that's what he needs to do. If I leave the room when he's getting dressed, he can't figure out how to button his shirt. He usually doesn't put on his socks, and he most often puts his shoes on the wrong feet. Use I or we statements. That's one of the most effective tools for clearly expressing oneself and exchanging opinions in a way that's respectful of the other person while taking care of our own needs and goals in a conversation. I statements describe your own viewpoint, not necessarily a fact about a situation. Avoid put-downs, judgment, or assigning blame. Sound more like speaking from the heart because you're saying, this is what I need or I believe. Teaches the listener something about you and opens the door to help resolve conflict. On the other hand, you statements tell someone else how they didn't meet your expectations, are usually accusatory and place blame on the other person, often increase anger and frustration. The listener has more trouble concentrating on what's being said because they have to concentrate on defending themselves, not on hearing you. And this makes resolving any problems more unlikely. Think about the difference in how you feel if someone says to you, I need your help, or if they say, you never help me. Here are some other examples of I statements. I need some help with your father because I am feeling really tired and stressed. I feel really scared because I think her behavior is becoming dangerous. I want your help in coming up with possible ways to deal with this because I trust your input. It was my understanding that we all agreed to alternate weekends because that seemed fairest to everyone. Pay attention to nonverbal messages, especially your tone and body language. Remember that somewhere between 70 and 93% of what we actually communicate is nonverbal, and that tone and body language say more about our thoughts and feelings than actual words do. And perhaps most importantly, remember that if verbal and nonverbal messages don't match, people are more likely to believe the nonverbal message than the verbal one. Really listen to what's being said. Most of us do far more talking than listening. We frequently spend time and energy either waiting for the other person to take a breath so we can say something, or thinking how we're going to respond when someone is still talking. We may be hearing words that are being said, but we miss the subtle tone changes in voice that tell us how the other person is feeling and the emotions they are trying to communicate. Provide feedback. Feedback is a great way to let the person who is talking know that we're really listening. It can be a nod of the head, and I'm sorry you feel that way, or a question that helps clarify what the other person is trying to communicate. Another way to clarify what a person actually means is to say, what I hear you saying is, or what do you mean when you say? Remember that we all see the world differently, and the goal of the conversation is to get the participants as close to a mutual understanding as possible. Summarize what conclusions have been reached or decisions have been made during the conversation. While many of the same skills that we use to communicate with family and friends are applicable to our communication with medical providers, there are also some general additional guidelines that will help make those conversations more productive. Take a family member or a friend with you if at all possible. Many conversations with medical care providers are stressful and spoken in a language that many of us don't understand completely. In addition, when conversations are so critical, we have more difficulty clearly conveying our concerns and hearing and remembering what's said in response. The person who accompanies you can take notes, remind you of important questions, and generally provide emotional support during the medical visit. If you're unable to physically take a person into the appointment with you, try to connect them to the conversation via a phone call. Don't forget to bring a pen and pencil with you. Be even more prepared than for other critical conversations. Make a list of your concerns and prioritize them. If there is information you want to convey, write down what you want to say, or at least make some notes about the topic or topics and key points. Not only will this ensure that you address important concerns and questions, it will also go far in ensuring that you have the time to address everything you want to within the time limits of the appointment. One way to prepare for communication with a medical care provider is to begin that communication before a visit. Use the electronic medical record, patient portal, or call the office and talk with the appropriate nurse or other staff person. If written information is going to a medical provider's office, be sure to include the date of your loved one's last appointment or the date of the upcoming one, and a statement that you do not want to discuss these details in front of the person living with dementia, if that's the case. Ask questions to clarify what you're being told. Don't hesitate to ask for clarification if you don't understand what's being said. Don't be intimidated by medical jargon and language. Ask for written instructions. Make sure the medical care provider tells you what he wants to do and what he wants you to do before the next visit, including any changes you need to make. Many individuals who are living with dementia are also living with other chronic diseases and may be seeing multiple specialists. I found that keeping a list of my husband's diagnoses and when these were made, and keeping a list of medications, including when they were started, when the dosage changed, or when a medication was discontinued, was one of my best tools. This is especially helpful if there's been a significant change in any of your loved one's diagnoses or treatments. It's also helpful to keep notes about visits in a notebook. You may want to keep the original notes taken during a visit or write a summary of important points from the visit, depending on which would be easier and clearer for you to use for a quick reference. Before we leave this topic, I need to say a few words about crucial conversations that fail in spite of all the time and energy we put into preparing for them. Sometimes we have to know when we've put enough effort into trying to build the kind of relationship we need with someone else. There may be a friend or family member that we need to put on the back burner for a while. That doesn't mean forever, but don't waste energy essentially beating your head against the wall when there is so much demand in your day-to-day life. Pat's YouTube video, Handling Family Problems, says more about this topic. I'd like to share a quote from Julia Roberts that's appropriate to this topic. When people walk away from you, let them go. Your destiny is never tied to anyone who leaves you. And it doesn't mean that you're bad people. It just means that their part in your story is over. You also need to trust your instincts and judgment. This goes back to one of Pat's 5 Ps, that of being perceptive. Although this applies to families and friends, it carries even more weight when working with medical providers. You know your loved one better than anyone else does, especially since you're in the role of caregiver. Your insights and observations are frequently more important than those of a medical care provider. He knows the general course of dementia. You know the specifics of life for the person living with dementia. If the provider you're seeing doesn't listen and ignores your questions, observations, and input, it might be time to move on. Firing a medical provider is easy. Simply don't go back. Talk with others you trust to find the kind of provider that will listen and support you in whatever way you need. Pat also says more about this topic in her video, The Right Doctor. In summary, let's review the crucial points for having these very important conversations. Plan ahead. Set the stage, hopefully somewhere comfortable, quiet, and undisturbed. Use I statements. Think about starting with, I need your help. Listen carefully and actively. Be aware of nonverbal messages. Summarize any decisions and make sure both people heard the same thing. Identify next steps if needed. Then breathe and pat yourself on the back. Know that you've done the best you can do and gained valuable information, whether the outcome of the conversation was what you had hoped for or not. And doing the best one can is all we can ever expect of any caregiver.